Okay, welcome to what hopefully is the first in maybe a little mini series of webinars. We'll see how this one goes first. If I just introduce myself, I'm Dave Serpell-Stevens. I've worked for Autism Hampshire for about 25 years. I started off work in the school that we used to run just outside Southampton. Pretty soon after I joined, I got put forward to become an instructor in an approach called ProAct Skip, which is based on positive behavior support. Some of you might be bridling at this point. Just let me continue. I'm no longer a ProAct Skip instructor. I no longer go along with positive behavior support because in some cases, not so much to do with the actual approach, but the way it's actually implemented, supposedly on behalf of autistic people. I find a few problems with that, particularly in terms of the outcomes that are sought by that, and also reducing things to behavior and a lot of other stuff. But anyway, one thing I am grateful for is at the beginning of that process, it became clear that, you never look at anybody's behavior in isolation and make a knee-jerk response to it. You've got to be a bit more intelligent about it. You've got to sort of step back a bit, not only look at the behavior, but look at what the person's achieving by it and seeing if there's a better, if it's problematic, seeing if there's a better way that the person can achieve it. Even more importantly, sort of look at what the precursor is, what happens before the behavior. Are they in an environment that's unsuitable? Are they with people who don't understand them, etc., etc.? Part of the process of understanding what happens before is, of course, trying to see the world through other people's eyes. And as I was working with autistic students at that point, I decided to do a really deep dive on, finding out as much as I could about the experience of being autistic. Pretty soon, I got beyond what I would term sort of standard mainstream research. There's still a lot of it out there, mainly conducted by non-autistic and non-neurodivergent people. And, discovered a really rich vein of work by actually autistic people. At that point, you had to kind of do a bit of searching to find these people. I mean, you still do in some cases, but where we are now, we have autistic people beginning to sort of infiltrate, if you like, or take hold of the narrative in it at every level. So from activists, vloggers, bloggers, right up to renowned academics. Some of you might have heard on the news this morning, a guy called Jason Arday, who is not only the first Black professor at Cambridge, who's shortly to be appointed as such, but who's autistic, didn't speak until he was 11, didn't learn to read until I think he said he was 18. So all pretty amazing, but it's beginning, so it's a bit easier to come across that information. But anyway, to cut to the chase, one thing I realized very early on is that there was a massive discrepancy in some cases between what mainstream research was saying about autistic people and what autistic people were saying themselves. And so I opted to sort of mainly use autistic people as a source of information. That changed the kind of training that I did, hopefully made it better. One of the offshoots from that as well was that as I read more and more accounts of what it is to be autistic, I realized that I'm in fact autistic myself. It explained a lot of things. So yeah, I got diagnosed about 4 years ago, but I was accepted for at least 10 years before that I was autistic myself. You have to start questioning yourself when a lot of your training consists of, illustrating points with personal anecdotes, wondering where that comes from. Okay, just a few practicalities. Now I've kind of introduced myself. If we have about a 10-minute break, so about 5 to 11 till 5 past 11, that will make it nicely symmetrical apart from anything, although we did start at 5 past, but we won't talk about that. Yeah, if I just start the presentation, then we can go through a few more bits of information actually about the structure of the course. So hopefully everybody can see that. Just bear with me for a minute. Okay, so understanding autistic people. It's necessarily in 2 hours we're not going to, we're going to scratch the surface. So I've had to kind of reduce it to a couple of sort of key concepts and try and make it as punchy as possible within the time, but we can't possibly cover everything. So for anything that you would like further information on, if you can type questions in the chat, Izzy, who's the co-organizer, will then compile those and group them according to topic. And any relatively straightforward questions, hopefully we can deal with in about 10 minutes at the end of the session. But beyond that, the remainder will be addressed in a general message within 2 weeks of the second group completing their webinar on the 16th of March. So you're the first group, there'll be a completely separate group doing the webinar on the 16th. And yeah, after that, obviously it makes sense then for us to sort of send out a group message addressing broadly those groups of questions. So in terms of what we're going to do today, we're going to be define or redefine being autistic in the context of the neurodiversity paradigm. I'm going to say something quite controversial right from the beginning. I'm going to say autism doesn't exist. Autistic people do, but autism as a separate entity does not exist. And so personally, you will find that I will contort myself into, jump through hoops, not to use the word autism in isolation. I'll always refer to autistic people or being autistic. We're going to explore the truth of some common beliefs concerning autistic people and kind of question them. Briefly identify 4 key areas in which autistic people may operate differently, and then suggest some basic adjustments to accommodate differences. Obviously, in a session of this length, those suggestions are going to be pretty generic, and they're mainly going to be associated with one aspect of being autistic, which is a bit of an overarching aspect of being autistic that we'll go into a bit later. Okay, I'm going to start off with a bit of I normally run this as a celebrity quiz, but since you're all muted, that's not going to work very well. So I'm just going to briefly go around these celebrities. Obviously, this is a fictitious magazine, one of several fictitious publications that I've formulated. A few more, and I might be able to open a fictitious newsagents. But they're all pretty well known. So number 1 is Greta Thunberg, who you'll be aware is an environmental campaigner and activist. Number 2 is Melanie Sykes. She used to be a model. She took part in some quite funny and classic Boddington's beer adverts, I think in the 1990s. They're still online if you want to check them out. More recently, she's become, I think, a chat show host and general celebrity. Number 3, by way of contrast, Anthony Hopkins, very much a national treasure, an actor. Usually when I ask people when they're not muted, famous films, they always come up with Silence of the Lambs first. Now, you might be aware, Anthony Hopkins is a bit of a curmudgeonly character on occasions. And he might well get quite irritated by the fact that the first role that anybody identifies with him is Hannibal Lecter. The thing is, a basic understanding of human psychology would probably tell you that if you play the part of a character who eats other people, that's probably the character that most people will think of first when your name comes up. Number 4, this is a Japanese digital animator. Now, he's probably quite a rich digital animator at this point. His name is Satoshi Tajiri, and he is basically the father of Pokemon. Now, he practically invented them. He's probably a character who's semi-worshipped by some sectors of the autistic community. Number 5 is Guy Martin. When you drill down to basics, he is basically a truck engineer, but fascinated by the internal combustion engine, which probably put him on a collision course with Greta Thunberg, who's trying to encourage us to use such things less. But anyway, so basically a truck engineer, but he's become a TV personality, and more recently, in the last couple of years, he's done things like he entered the TT race on the Isle of Man, and he also undertook some pretty scary attempts to break the land speed record. Serious stuff in Utah with vehicles with fire coming out of the back. Number 6 is Hannah Gadsby. She's an Australian comedian. She's had a series on Netflix. She's also, I think, toured the UK fairly recently. Apparently she appears on QI programs like that from time to time, so she is quite she's becoming quite well known. Still a little bit niche. Number 7, a lot of people will recognize if they happen to watch late afternoon TVs, Anne Hegarty, who is a chaser on a quiz program called The Chase. She's also appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, I'm told. Number 8 is Tim Burton, quite a quirky film director. A lot of people agree that he's gone off the boil recently, but that seems to be what happens to all creativity in Hollywood eventually. But anyway, particularly his early films, very, very distinctively lit. He tended to collect actors, so for 10 years or so, possibly more. If you saw a film with Johnny Depp in it, chances are it was a Tim Burton film. Helena Bonham Carter has appeared in quite a lot of his films. Before that, Michael Keaton. Pretty distinctive films, though. If you were brought into a Tim Burton film about halfway through, nobody told you who the director was, you could tell quite quickly it was a Tim Burton film. There are certain tropes, there are certain sort of homages to his favorite vintage films, i.e. vintage horror films and science fiction films from the 1950s. And then there are other sort of giveaway telltale signs. Number 9, Chris Packham. I'm a bit disappointed that all of you are muted, because usually it gets people to shout out, what does Chris Packham do? And usually somebody who's a bit over enthusiastic shouts out naturist. He is definitely not a naturist. He is a naturalist, an expert and presenter of TV programs such as Autumn Watch, Spring Watch, etc., etc. Those of you who've seen him recently will know where I'm going with this, in that all these people are autistic. That's what they have in common. They're all autistic. Now, I referred to Jason Arday earlier on, who was featured on the news this morning, the first black and autistic professor at Cambridge. Well, the first out autistic, if you like. There are probably plenty of autistic lecturers in any university, but anyway, who might be undiagnosed. But anyway, I zipped through some of the press coverage, and sure enough, you still get this narrative about autistic people who make it, so to speak. There was one headline that said, autistic man or man with autism beats the autism and becomes university professor. And that's still, in a lot of people's minds, there's still this sort of narrative that, these people have overcome their autism, they've beaten their autism, they didn't let their autism stop them, etc., etc. People like me would invert that narrative and say, well, actually, no, you've got that wrong. There are certain attributes concerning being autistic that have actually helped them get where they are today. Now, not everybody, I'll agree, not all autistic people get to tap in and use these attributes, because sometimes the day-to-day existence is just a question of survival, and some of you in the audience will know what that means. Because either you've gone unrecognized for a long time, or people don't understand you or don't accept you, or you might have additional things to cope with, like apraxias, which we'll maybe touch on a bit later, which make life more of a struggle. Totally accept that. But there is one attribute, I think, above all others, that pretty much all autistic people have, which is help these people and a lot of other people, in their lives, which is, if it's appreciated, which is the ability to hyperfocus. And I say that's an attribute. It's not a skill, because a skill is something that you learn. It's just that our brains are geared up in that way, that we're not going to dissipate our energies on thousands of different topics to a superficial degree. We're going to zero in on one or two topics at the time, or one or two points of interest, and give them our all. If you've got that attribute, as I say, if circumstances in your life allow it, then I would say that most autistic people have that capacity to become an expert in something. Maybe not to the level of these people. I'm not in any way presenting these people as if they're representative of the entire autistic community, either on a group or an individual basis. But I am saying, just teasing out these points. So everybody has that opportunity. So I'm not talking about expert at this level necessarily. I'm talking about, maybe there's a kid who knows more about Pokemon than anybody else their age. Maybe there's an adult who knows more about engineering than any of it is more sort of has a keener eye for detail than a lot of their workmates. Yeah, there's an entire spectrum there. So despite that, though, officially speaking, those people, those of you in the audience who are autistic, myself, are officially labeled as being disordered, deficient, and impaired. And you still get that sort of terminology. I mean, officially speaking, we share a diagnosis, which is autism spectrum disorder. Nobody is going to celebrate being told that they've got a disorder. Nobody is going to celebrate the fact that they've been identified as having deficits and impairments. Now, that's not to say that we don't have struggles, but a lot of the time the struggles are as a result of being misunderstood and not being accommodated, i.e. adjustments or changes not being made to our environment or the way that people interact with us or the kind of expectations they have of us based on their own preferences. That can be, and it gets even worse when we're trying to interact with services quite often who don't understand us and can't deliver what we're after in a way that suits our autistic brains. So just to define those words, I mean, disorder is not being ordered. Somebody somewhere has decided what it is to be ordered and decided that we don't fit that. And you can't look at it any other way. It has totally negative connotations. If you have a deficit, you have bits missing. If you have an impairment, it means you're broken in some way. Now, if you got a package through the post that you'd ordered online and the object inside was either disordered, had deficits, or was impaired, you'd definitely send it back. If you had something that was deficient or impaired in your house, what would you do? You would order the missing bits, make it whole again. If it was impaired, you would try and get it mended. And the same thing by using this language, there's still a lot of thought out there that we need some sort of fixing, that we've got bits missing, that we're broken. And that has led historically to a lot of approaches which really don't help autistic people. At a very basic level, it surely doesn't help our self-esteem or our sense of ourselves. So because you can still go to, the majority of websites and sources of information and get lots of negative stuff about what it means to be autistic, it'll just point to deficits and impairments from a very, what I call a neurotypical standpoint. So, these deficits, impairments, and forms of disorder are based on comparing autistic people and the way that they function to neurotypical people, which is not, shouldn't be how it works really. But anyway, I'm going to just list some potential positive autistic attributes. And again, I'm not calling them skills, things we might be born with because our brains are connected up differently. So hyperfocus, as we said, that ability to focus very intently on one thing for a period of time or for a lifetime, say in the case of Chris Packham. A degree of perfectionism has a positive side, which is, if you want something done in detail, want something done very thoroughly, if it coincides with somebody's strong interest, they're the person for the job. There is a negative side of perfectionism, which we might cover a bit later, and that's driven by different things, and passion. We are not unempathetic, unemotional robots, but we are capable, some of us, again, if we're not too preoccupied with the daily struggle, we're capable of logical and objective thought. It's not always welcome, and sometimes maybe our timing is a bit off. So if somebody's just received some bad news and bursts into tears, put in a nutshell, they would rather have a cuddle than a flow diagram to show them, a way out of this situation. That might come later, but at the right point, we might have an ability with other people to cut through a lot of emotional, sentimental stuff that is clouding their vision, and just cut to the quick and suggest some very pithy and pertinent ways of resolving a situation. It's often said we're honest in a very kind of bold way, that we can never lie. That is not the case. Autistic people can lie. Some autistic people that I've come across lie spectacularly badly. So in the spur of the moment, they're not looking at the evidence around them that tends to suggest that they did whatever they've been questioned about. A lot of people lie as a form of camouflaging as well, because they're so used to people pointing out their mistakes that inevitably we become very, very sensitive to any form of criticism, because criticism is sometimes such a huge aspect of our lives. And so we naturally default to, it wasn't me, it was nothing to do with me, I wasn't there, or whatever is a defense mechanism. But in a lot of cases, we can, again, it's a bit like linked in with the logical and objective stuff, we can be very honest and just kind of like say it how it is, which, personally speaking, I think the world would work better if more people did that. We don't tend to play sort of office politics and stuff like that. A lot of us have a keen sense of justice or injustice. So in terms of what's been done to us, we might, if nobody says sorry, or situations aren't resolved, we might hang on to those instances or those episodes in our lives forever. And every time we think of them, or something that's happened to us triggers that sort of memory, it might bring all the anger or the disappointment or whatever back. But we also feel a keen sense of injustice on behalf of other people, again, depending on our own, how stressful our lives are, or how preoccupied we are with our own just getting through the day. So yeah, we will often sort of stick our heads above the parapet and say, to use an idiom, we will often be the one in a given environment who will speak out if somebody else is being treated unjustly. I've done that myself. I know a lot of autistic people who have. It costs us very dear, because once we've done that, we know we're in for months of stress, anxiety, sleeplessness, and all the rest of it, endlessly going through what we've said. Did we say it in the right way? Did we come across as just angry? Have we got the right argument? Have we got the right end of the stick? Have we got the right understanding of that situation, etc.? But it doesn't stop us doing it sometimes. Might have a very good memory for specific facts, quite often more around our areas of strong interest. Really important point. We are natural autodidacts, by which I mean that we prefer to teach ourselves. And so a lot of strong interests tend to be people on the internet or reading books or whatever, because for reasons that will become apparent a bit later on, once you start introducing other human beings and a lot of other complications, sometimes the actual ability to learn is lost in the sheer effort of having to cope with so many environmental, interpersonal, social, communicative challenges. So this is why a lot of autistic people find school, college, university really difficult, because it's all done in an intensely social sort of way. So if you like, you've got the pure learning, but then you've got piled on top of it, as I say, social interactions. You've got to negotiate with a lot of people who might not understand you, communicative, verbal and non-verbal situations to negotiate, sensory input, etc. There are too many layers on top of the learning to be able to sort of fully engage sometimes. We have an eye for detail, but also I think a lot of us are blessed with brains that, again, given the right set of circumstances, we can often see the big picture, because we can connect. As long as we've got lots of facts about a particular topic stored in our brain already, a new fact coming in, we can connect that very quickly to a lot of facts that we didn't even know we had stored, and which a lot of people think are entirely unconnected, to come up with a new perspective. I could go on, but just to summarize, if what is at the core of being autistic is that your brain is connected up in different ways to other people, then that changes everything. It changes your perspective on everything. You cannot help, given the right set of circumstances, to think in an unconventional type of way, to be original and creative. But again, you can't do that if every single day is just a question of a struggle to get through to the end of the day. So none of this can flourish except with understanding, acceptance, and accommodation. And thankfully, the acceptance bit is becoming more mainstream. You might be aware that the forthcoming, what used to be called Autism Awareness Week, is now called Autism Acceptance Week. You know, we need to be accepted as, you know, valid members of the human race, not broken, not deficient, not disordered, different. And that means that we need accommodation. We need things to change around us. We don't need people to assume that we operate in exactly the same way as the majority of the population all the time. Otherwise, things will go wrong. Okay, I'm going to say a little bit about strong interest since we're on the topic. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth because there isn't time. But strong interests and maintaining strong interests is of vital importance for autistic people. It plays a huge part in our lives. And it also means that if they are nurtured correctly, and they're encouraged by at least some people around us, and that we succeed in kind of branching out in terms of the central interest and finding out new aspects of that interest that we can explore, which any autistic folk in the audience will know that's really exciting when you find a new branch to explore. So it's a bit like a tree. When you first plant an acorn or a chestnut or a beech nut, and it germinates, for the first, for a number of months, that plant is going to be all stalk. And that's a bit like when we discover the pure interest for the first time and get hooked by that interest. As long as people don't bully us because it's niche, or other people don't convince us that it's invalid, boring, geeky, or whatever, if we were able to sort of stick to our guns and there are at least some people nurturing this and encouraging us, then quite naturally, just like a tree, this will begin to grow branches. And these branches will quite often take us into areas that people would identify as being problematic for us. So I'll just explore a couple of key ones here. I won't explore all of them. Right, social life. So, well, before I start that, the more that people can wrap stuff that we have to do, so education, and a lot of other contexts, if they can bring in our strong interests, this is going to be a distinct advantage. But as I said, I'll just pick up a couple of these fruit, although they actually look like inflated rubber balls. Social life. A lot of people say about autistic people, what's the first thing that comes into mind about autistic people? Well, they struggle socially. Yeah, they don't have many social skills. Some of them are positively antisocial, etc., etc. We do struggle socially if all our lives we've been told there's one way to socialize, and that way is that we're going to groom you to become the kind of person who can flit round a drinks party, with a glass of prosecco in one hand and a canapé in the other, just randomly introducing yourself to strangers. Hello, I'm Dave. I don't believe we've met. I'm Dave Stevens. I'm an autistic trainer. And yourself? How very interesting. Yes. Yes. Hasn't the weather been terrible recently? That sort of stuff. Those of you who are autistic will know that that's really difficult. It involves small talk, it involves schmoozing, mingling, and all the rest of it, and we feel very much out of our comfort zone. Some of us are taught to mask, which is a bit of a disaster, and that is a huge effort. And again, that's a product of being told that there's only one way to do this stuff. There is an alternative, which is autistic people generally tend to get on best and feel most comfortable with people who share a very strong interest or who are interested in a cause that we're interested in. We're also interested in people who don't make small talk and who don't need constant maintenance as well. So that if we don't need to be going down the pub with them every 5 minutes, we don't need to be texting them every 5 minutes. The friends of mine that have remained over the years, we might see each other once every month, once every 2 months or something, but nobody complains, hello, stranger, or whatever. We just pick up from where we left off and feel totally comfortable with each other. As I say, we don't spend, when we meet, we don't spend the first 20 minutes talking about the weather, Kim Kardashian's plastic surgery, mainstream pop music, celebrity culture, etc., etc. So it's a different type of socializing. The more autistic people can be shown alternatives, look, you're different. Actually, we're going to point you in the direction of other people who share a strong interest of yours, rather than teach you mainstream social skills. You need a minimum of social skills to actually operate, in a world inhabited largely by people who aren't autistic. But that's just a bridge kind of thing. For the real socializing, concentrate on other people who share a strong interest. Find clubs, find groups of people online, offline, or whatever who share their interest, and see where that goes. It may, if that strong interest is developed, it may lead to work. Not everybody wants to, in their eyes, exploit their strong interest for work, but it might be an option. Obviously, if you land a job that caters to your strong interest, where you are not micromanaged, you're recognized as being a bit of an expert in your field, that might not seem like work anymore, and it might strip away a lot of the difficulties that are associated with work. Not everybody wants to do that. Some people want to keep the strong interest and work entirely separate. Real biggie. 80% of us, according to official statistics, experience poor mental health, either sporadic. There is nothing inevitable about that. Poor mental health is not an attribute of being autistic. It's to do with what life has thrown at you. And whether you have been accepted for who you are, or whether people have, however, with whatever good intentions, tried to mold you into somebody who looks less autistic. But having said that, a lot of us do experience, particularly stress and anxiety related conditions. It's often said in that case that we ought to, and quite legitimately, that actually taking up mindfulness meditation is quite effective at counteracting some of the effects of long-term anxiety and stress, PTSD and stuff. That's all very well, but it practically ignores the fact that autistic people pretty much invented the whole idea of mindfulness meditation, because the state, the mental state that you want to get into when you're doing mindfulness meditation is pretty much identical to the mental state that you get into when you're hyper-focusing on your strong interest. It has the same characteristics. You are absolutely and completely concentrating on one thing. That means that you get into a state where you're no longer worrying about stuff that happened in the past, no longer worrying about stuff that may or may not happen in the future, no longer worrying in the moment about whether you are handsome, ugly, whether your ears stick out, whether you're too short, etc., etc. You're just in the moment. And that's very good for anybody's mental health. So rather than pack people off with a little kit containing incense sticks, a statue of the smiling Buddha, a little instruction leaflet about how to get into the full lotus position, and a CD of whale song, maybe people ought to be saying, right, let's make sure that you schedule in enough time every single day, to spend on your strong interest, and have enough time to get into that hyper-focused state, because that will go a long way to alleviating the stress and anxiety. Obviously, long term, the most important step is doing something about the sources of stress and anxiety, changing things around the person, and so that they don't experience such high degrees of stress and anxiety. Okay, so these strong interests, nurturing strong interests provides opportunities for what I would call authentic autistic development and growth. Whereas exclusively focusing on coping skills, so, autistic is who we are. So for people to say, I'm going to give you some strategies for coping with your autism, is quite an odd sort of thing to say, really. And again, it places all the onus on us. There's something wrong with you, and so you need to learn to cope with it. What we need to, cope with is the stress and anxiety. And as I say, long term, what we need is somebody to do something about stress and anxiety and alleviate it in some way. So an exclusive focus on coping or learning what I call neurotypical skills limits such opportunities. So we don't get to grow as autistic people. We get to grow up to be people who do passable imitations of not being autistic. And that always ends up in disaster sooner or later, because of the sheer effort in putting on that performance whenever we're around other people. And often only reinforces feelings of inadequacy and alienation. So you could be the best masker, Oscar-winning performance in terms of masking. Inside, there's the terror of thinking sooner or later I'm going to do or say something that other people are going to find a bit weird, and the contrast between the kind of character that I've invented and my real self is going to be really big, and people are going to be really surprised, taken aback, probably a bit disturbed. But also I'm having to constantly self-monitor, and I've constantly got that impression it's like I'm on stage all the time. So what we're talking about here is really two competing, what we call paradigms. Don't worry about the terminology. Two competing definitions or approaches to being autistic. There's the pathology approach, which medicalizes everything. And really at the base of it, there's this assumption that any brain structure not considered, in inverted commas, normal requires a cure or therapy. And we already saw that the language of that is disordered, deficient, and impaired. The paradigm of neurodiversity, and neurodiversity applies to every single human being on the planet. So you cannot refer to a neurodiverse person. Neurodiversity is the concept, which is very, very inclusive of all different types of brain structure. Within that, within neurodiversity, there are groups of people who are identified as neurodivergent. And those might be autistic, some might be diagnosed with ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, or whatever. Quite a wide group. So that's the distinction. But the concept of neurodiversity accepts that variation in brain structure is not only a natural, but also a necessary part of human diversity. So where would we be without Greta Thunberg's, Anthony Hopkins, Chris Packham's, Tim Burton's, etc.? And I mean, that's just a very, very small list. And those are only people who are in the public eye. You know, there are loads of us out there, either diagnosed or undiagnosed, who, given the right set of circumstances, have a very valuable contribution because our brains don't operate in the same way as everybody else. So we come up with alternative perspectives. And the language of neurodiversity is different, divergent, unique. We refer to people as being variants on being human, rather than being disordered, deficient, or impaired humans. Neurodiversity does not shy away from the very real problems that autistic people face still as a result of misunderstandings and stuff, but the language is much more gentle and less negative. For time, 1:45, okay. So just before the break, let's explore what we might let's try and boil being autistic down to its core characteristics or attributes. So as you notice, this is the fruit bowl. Just to get it out of the way to begin with, as the graphics progress, you'll notice that all the fruit in the fruit bowl is whole. And I'm going to be talking about fruit salads. And as we all know, you have to chop fruit salads. Now, if I'd, I just get a basic PowerPoint package, shapes, and so I construct the graphics just out of shapes. If I'd have tried to represent chopped fruit, I would definitely be suffering some stress-related disorder at this point and not have got it finished. So just bear with me. But if I explain this fruit salad analogy was invented by a person called Donna Williams, who some of you might have heard of. She was one of the first adults to be able to get a book published detailing a sort of a biography, an autobiography, detailing her life as an autistic person from the point of view of an actually autistic person. And I think she published it sometime in the late 1980s, at which time the field was utterly dominated by the medical profession. And so it was a lot different. She was an amazing person. So what she said was, if you could imagine that rather than doing this online, we were doing this at an actual physical venue, and rather than have you all come in at once, I stopped you from doing that and asked you to just queue up outside. And then I explained what I was going to do. So I said to you, right, in a minute, I'm going to invite you all in one by one. Okay, when you get into the training space, I'm going to give you a bowl and point you in the direction of a table. That table is piled high with every type of fruit you could imagine. There are sharp knives, there is a corer, there are chopping boards, there's a couple of cartons of fruit juice. So what I need you to do is make me a fruit salad. I want it to be your individual effort, so take absolutely no notice of other people's efforts. So when you'd all done that and you were sitting around, if I attempted to judge between your fruit salads, there's a very limited set of criteria or rules that I could summon up in order to judge whether somebody's effort was a fruit salad or wasn't a fruit salad. Okay, obviously, if somebody presented an empty bowl and hadn't done anything at all, that's obvious. Next stage up, I think most people agree, if somebody just chopped a load of banana and put it in a bowl, even if they put a cherry garnish on top, that would in fact be a bowl of chopped banana with a cherry on top. Still not a fruit salad. So we'd have to sort of agree on some sort of minimum variety of fruit, 3-4 varieties of fruit before we would call it a fruit salad. And maybe a bit of fruit juice in. Above and beyond that, I would have to accept that although your dishes would look very, very different from one another in some cases, that nevertheless, they're all fruit salads. Some of you might have used common ingredients. So several people may have used pineapple in their fruit salads. But even there, providing that they weren't copying other people, they would have put differing quantities of pineapple in their bowls according to their own personal taste. But I'd still have to admit that still doesn't stop it being a fruit salad. So we're looking at the core of what it is to be autistic. You could present with sensory differences. They might be, at a degree where they're in some cases they're causing difficulty in your lives because you're not getting accommodation for it. And so getting diagnosed with sensory processing disorder, I hate the word disorder, but that's what people call it. Again, you might be able to get some adjustments, which mean that, you can work in a less noisy environment or an environment where there isn't so much visual distraction, smells, whatever it is that you need. People might understand your stims a bit better. Stims are things that sometimes people, but all people have stims. Autistic people have specific stims to either calm their nervous system down if they've been exposed to a lot of sensory input, unpleasant sensory input, or conversely, to wake themselves up and make themselves more alert if needs be. Let me just admit that person. Oh, somebody else has. I know them. Okay, but they would not be recognized as being autistic necessarily. Same person might highlight social differences. I'm okay, one-to-one with people in a quiet venue, in a familiar venue, maybe more than one person on occasion, as long as it doesn't get too raucous. I'm okay with that. Parties, conventional sort of, big gatherings and stuff, nah. Used to do that, but I used to have to get completely drunk to get through that or anesthetize myself in some other way. I found that I masked all the way through it, which meant that I was absolutely and utterly exhausted afterwards. Sometimes I have panic attacks during. So I don't do that anymore. Even with these two attributes, most mainstream diagnostic services would not recognize you as being autistic. Now, at this point, a lot of autistic people would be thinking, let's probe a bit deeper here, because I do think that you're autistic. But we're talking sort of officially here. So officially speaking, it's not until you have a whole fruit salad or cluster of attributes or characteristics, and those characteristics obviously are interconnected. They work in tandem with one another to give you a really different view of a lot of everyday situations, both your external world and your internal world, that you might be considered as being autistic. Now, I will say the diagnostic service, good as it is still based on a quite a medical model. And so to get support, you need to prove there's something wrong with you. So you see where this is going. You look forward to a future where we might be recognized for being autistic rather than diagnosed, because we are not ill. We are who we are. So we might be recognized for being autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, and appropriate supports put in where we need it, and appropriate nurturing and encouragement, recognizing that we'll have some positive attributes that really need to be cultivated. Okay, so that's just a quote from Donna Williams. Whilst we can talk of autism spectrum disorder, it's an old quote, so she's still using that language. There is no one type of autism, because autism is like a fruit salad. For each person diagnosed with autism, the pieces in that fruit salad can be many or few, big or small, exotic or common. So these traits, attributes will appear in all four of these areas. So thinking, communication, social interaction, and sensory perception. Now, in traditional autism awareness training, this is the point at which people would identify these being areas of deficit and impairment. Far more helpful if you think about perception in these areas as being different, not wrong. So you're going to go with the style of thinking, if you go with the style of communication, if you introduce alternatives to mainstream social interaction, if you recognize that people's sensory perception of the world might not be the same as your own, but that might, given the wrong set of circumstances, that'll have a downside, be quite stressful. Given the right set of circumstances, there's also probably some positives in that. These differences, just like the fruit salads, will be absolutely unique to each individual. So understanding acceptance and accommodation reduces the individual's experience of disability. So neurodiversity would say that, is being autistic or neurodivergent necessarily just a disability? It may be up to a certain degree, but beyond that, what really disables us, again, is people's lack of understanding, acceptance, and accommodation of us. So autistics do not require treatments, therapies, or meds specifically aimed at eradicating, managing, or coping with autism. So autistic is who we are. So to medicate ourselves for that seems a bit odd. Okay, I shall skip that because we're getting near the break. And as usual, I vastly overestimated the amount of information that you can fit into an hour. So some of you might be sort of saying, what's he talking about? I suffer routinely high levels of anxiety and stress. Isn't that down to my autism, etc.? Is he saying that I shouldn't avail myself of every therapy that's going to try and alleviate that? Of course not. But we need to recognize that, here are to go back to the fruit salad. If somebody had sneakily smuggled in a carrot and grated the carrot into the fruit salad, whilst that might taste good, might make a really nice mixture with certain types of fruit, I would have to point out that carrot, even though it accompanies the fruit quite well, is not the same as the fruit. That still remains in a separate category. That is still a vegetable. And in the same way, comorbidity should not be confused with what is at the core of being autistic. So if we just display the little squiggly diagram in the middle as being representative of the core characteristics of being autistic, there is no doubt that a lot of us might have some of these things going on. I've divided these what called comorbidities or co-occurring conditions into two categories. One is acquired and one is from birth. One set is it from birth. So amongst the acquired conditions might be anxiety, stress, depression, PTSD, stress-related disorders, etc., etc. Just like everybody else, these are more to do with what life has thrown at you, your life experiences. They are not core characteristics of being autistic, and so they are avoidable. But you have to get in really early, recognize people are autistic when they're very, very young, hopefully change enough about the world around them so that we're not routinely exposed to situations that sensorily overwhelm us, that socially exhaust us. Because all that sort of stuff, just like anybody else's body, puts us into defense mode or fight or flight mode. And you'll know there are a lot of changes that happen in the body, production of certain hormones, etc., etc. Our bodies no human being is geared up to be almost permanently in a state of fight or flight. If you are, you will develop anxiety, depression, PTSD, or whatever. Make sure people aren't exposed to that trauma or stress, things will go better. And in autistic people's cases, the sources of that anxiety, stress will be different from people who aren't autistic. And that's the trouble. Often they aren't taken into consideration. And so nobody thinks they can do anything about it. I've put gastrointestinal in there. there are two sides to that. Now, obviously, if you've got anxiety, depression, PTSD, and all that stuff going on, you're probably going to develop some sort of physical symptoms associated with that as an expression of that. So, you might develop IBS or periodic bloating and or diarrhea, discomfort, constipation, etc., etc. It's also perfectly possible autistic people can be born with, food intolerances or food allergies. So obviously, if you can identify that and get it properly medically diagnosed and cut out whatever food is causing the distress, that doesn't cure the person's autism, as some of the more quacky people online might claim. It takes away quite a significant layer of stress from an autistic person's lives. So they're possibly going to be calmer, a little more tolerant of a few more situations because they haven't got that constant discomfort. But it doesn't cure their autism. There are some conditions, medical conditions, that are more prevalent in the autistic community than in the neurotypical community. Ehlers-Danlos is a condition that affects the collagen in the body. The collagen is what forms part of the structure of skin, makes it stretchy. It forms also, certain key elements of the brain, veins, quite a lot of different functions in the body. But with Ehlers-Danlos, the collagen, which is this sort of stretchy material, might be a little more formed differently or produced differently. And it means that people who, for example, have hypermobility, which is a subcategory of Ehlers-Danlos, are prone to subluxation, which means that their joints pop out or become semi or totally dislocated on a regular basis. Incredibly painful and disabling. There are some gastrointestinal problems that might accompany it as well. As I say, that's very disabling. There are a higher percentage of autistic people who are born with Ehlers-Danlos than in other populations, but it's not inevitable, and I wouldn't say it's at the core of being autistic. Same with epilepsy. Higher percentage of autistic people are born with epilepsy. Again, that's not a core characteristic of being autistic necessarily. There are things called apraxias as well. So you may struggle with your motor control, because although there's nothing wrong with your brain particularly, but the messages from your brain to your limbs get slightly kind of garbled along the way, and you can't always guarantee that your limbs will do what you want them to. The same with speech. The same thing happens with speech. So you may not, you won't be non-verbal. You will be verbal, but you will struggle to speak in a conventional way. So you imagine all these three things. This is an example. These are examples of when there is a lot else going on in an autistic person's lives. If they're not getting the support with those medical conditions, and every day, is quite a struggle, and everyday self-help skills are a struggle. That's when the ability to hyperfocus and stuff might get a bit buried, particularly in the case of apraxias. If you don't speak, that you're also assumed to have a learning disability, and everybody sort of treats you as such and underestimate you. It's perfectly possible to have a learning disability in addition to being autistic, but the statistics are going down as we discover that particularly people who don't speak have been assumed to have a learning disability. When we introduce them to facilitated communication or digital forms of communication, it soon becomes apparent there's nothing really wrong with their cognitive functioning. So autistic people don't need fixing, but we do have a right to treatments, therapies, and medication, which, when adjusted to accommodate us, may alleviate or remedy comorbids. You'd be an idiot not to refuse sort of therapy or whatever for particularly for the physical conditions. But also, we need help if we do develop anxiety, depression, PTSD. But where it falls down is it's not often adapted to meet autistic needs. And so those of you who are autistic, it may be very difficult, but sometimes you're going to have to suggest to your therapist or whatever, look, face-to-face isn't working for me. The minute I step into the place, I go into fight or flight. This is causing me almost as much stress as the reason why I came here. I don't want that to happen. I don't want this to fail. Spontaneous questioning about my mental state or my mood state or how anxious I've been over the last week. These are big, bold, open questions. I really struggle to answer those, particularly if they sprung on me spontaneously. Could you start sending me back questionnaires that are very detailed? So if you do ask open questions, that you break them down into little subcategories so that I know exactly what it is you're trying to focus on, and so that I can focus on that and come up with something intelligent. And maybe we could explore, doing this online, or just cutting down on the amount of sort of direct contact time that we have together. You'll get better information from me sometimes without us meeting face to face. Okay, let's just leave that, because anxiety is sometimes produced in autistic people by other people who don't stick to the timings that they've specified. So somebody put in the chat box, would we be covering sort of, if you like, the interface or intersectionality? So how does being autistic sort of interface being ADHD? If I just display this slide. Okay, so again, increasingly it seems that putting people in distinct boxes, you are autistic, you have ADHD, etc., etc., it doesn't really work very well. I think for individuals, it becomes very confusing. And I've seen a number of people giving accounts of themselves by sort of saying, my ADHD side does this, my autistic side does this. It's quite confusing. If we got to a point where we viewed being neurodivergent as being like a wider fruit salad, if you like, to use that analogy that I used earlier on. And so that wider fruit salad, because nobody fits perfectly into a description of being autistic, ADHD, or whatever. There's a lot of interface, as I say. So if we could just recognize people for being neurodivergent, and then really on an individual basis, just identify their attributes. So some of those attributes might traditionally been associated with being autistic. Other of those attributes might be associated with being ADHD. There might be an element of dyslexia, dyscalculia, Tourette's, whatever it is, to a greater or lesser degree. But this makes up the whole person. And so to divide that person into separate bits is maybe not helpful. It would also, if this is the product of the medical model. So if you divide diseases and illnesses into different categories and the way they're diagnosed and treated, that works, but not with people's personalities, I would say, because neurodivergence is neither an illness nor a disease. And so recognition of a neurodivergence, a much wider neurodivergence fruit salad, maybe even lose the word diagnosis because we're not ill, might avoid a lot of stereotyping where you say you're autistic and then everybody makes a whole bunch of assumptions. Could you fix my laptop, for example? Solve this crime. Have a look at this. Could you just analyze this, this data for any glitches? It doesn't apply to all of us, but there are, I'm exaggerating, but there are distinct stereotypes. The same thing, there are a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about what it is to be ADHD. I personally, since getting diagnosis of being autistic, the more I've gone into, attributes being what's traditionally called ADHD, the more I recognize myself in those as well. So I don't think anybody fits snugly into these boxes, no matter how much people might want us to. So it's about dealing with the whole person. And as I said before, nurturing and encouraging the positive aspects of who they are, and supporting them with other aspects that might rub against the world, up against the outside world, and cause a few problems on an individual basis, rather than make blanket statements or possibly, operate a kind of one size fits all approach. Hopefully that addressed something of what you are asking about. Okay, if I just talk about the spectrum briefly, as you'll know, a lot of subtypes of being autistic, or Asperger's, Kanner's autism, childhood disintegrative disorder, etc., etc. It was over the years, it's been discovered that some of those separate categories of being autistic just don't exist. Childhood disintegrative disorder, for example. We're realizing that when children move from the home into play school, That's a really big move for autistic people. They go from hopefully an environment that's relatively quiet with relatively few people in it, relatively few demands, to an environment that's, you know, all primary colors and there's loads of stuff going on and kids, you know, making bad smells or, you know, making high pitched noise and it's too crowded and they're expected to join in with everybody, etc., etc. This is a really big move. Unsurprisingly, some of those autistic kids become very stressed to the extent where they can't speak and they can't really function very well because of the anxiety. And this just massive transition. That doesn't mean they became autistic at that age. It doesn't mean that vaccines that happen to have been given to them at the same time caused their autism. And you know, all those abilities are still there, but you've got to try and strip away the stress and anxiety so that they can get back to developing on a you know on their own trajectory and are not sort of delayed by the amount of stress and anxiety that they're suffering. But anyway, the most important point is all these subcategories of being autistic being rolled up into one diagnosis: autism spectrum. So far, so good. Disorder. They couldn't resist the word disorder, unfortunately. So the spectrum, you can, you know, according to your individual fruit salad, and we could, you know, follow on from what I said before and have a neurodivergence spectrum, but it should be placed within the human spectrum. The trouble is, if you present the spectrum as a line, and a lot of people I've seen in the past have done this, I probably did this in the past and just quickly drew on a flip chart, you know, a line, you are bound to place low functioning people at one end and high functioning at the other. You also, that line becomes separated in people's minds from the rest of humanity. And so, you know, it contributes to autistic people being perceived as being other, if you like. If you sit it firmly within the human spectrum, this isn't perfect, but maybe it's an attempt to make it a bit more inclusive. So sitting within the human spectrum is the autistic human spectrum. And you, according to your fruit salad, you would just be placed on that autistic spectrum somewhere. Now, some people might be very far apart on that spectrum. And so necessarily assuming that you just facilitate a meeting of a load of autistic people and expect them to get on together, that's not realistic. It's a bit like saying, you know, we'll organize something for red-haired people and you'll all get on because you've got something in common, your hair color. Except accentuated, because somebody as part of their fruit salad might be oversensitive to certain types of noise, hypersensitive to certain types of noise. If they're in an environment where they regularly come across somebody else who is hyposensitive to noise, so they are undersensitive to noise, and the hyposensitive person makes exactly the kind of noise that the other person can't stand, they should probably not, you know, hang out together. They should agree to, you know, not see each other. Having said that, a lot of autistic people have shared experiences, and we enjoy being around other autistic people so that we can totally be ourselves and talk about experiences and not be judged, and even have people sort of say, yeah, I find that as well. And it's comforting to come across other people who have that shared experience. But it's not always the case that we're going to get on and become bosom pals just because we're autistic. So we saw from the fruit salad that we are all autistic in a completely unique way. So all those subtypes that I mentioned, subgroupings, low, high functioning, Asperger's and all the rest of it, really don't make much sense. And it's another attempt to pigeonhole people, and people just will not fit comfortably into pigeonholes. So apart from the word disorder, it is much more helpful to view it as being a spectrum, and that each individual on that spectrum will be autistic in their own unique way. They won't be quite like anybody else. Now, I'm not talking about I'm not trying to mess with people's identities. Some people, you know, obviously identify as being Aspies and all the rest of it. That's fine. There are sort of blanket terms that the autistic community have invented for themselves, which are great because they create that sense of community that if I'm on, you know, if I'm part of an Aspie group or whatever, there are some people there who share experiences. They're not going to judge me harshly, etc. On some level, they're going to get me better than other people. I'm going to feel more comfortable around with them, as long as, you know, we don't have completely conflicting characteristics. Just a word on low and high functioning. going back to what I said before, the barriers, low high functioning creates barriers between different groups of autistic people. It denies people who identified low functioning the recognition that they too have the ability to hyperfocus and all the rest of it. And where assumptions of learning disability and low functioning are quite often based on not speaking, and that's compounded by people who are not speaking given either no real functioning or alternative or augmentative communication system, or if they are given it, it's very clunky and it doesn't develop as they develop as people, because people assume that they've got a learning disability, so why would they need a wide vocabulary? You can see the problems that causes. And as more of those people are discovering digital means, synthesized voice and stuff as a bridge to the outside world, as I say, more of those people are being discovered not to be cognitively impaired. Okay, let's just move on to, we've identified 4 different areas in which autistic people might be different. Hopefully this is going to lead to subsequent sessions where we might be able to focus in a bit more on individual areas. But I'm going to focus in on an area of sort of autistic thinking and one key concept in terms of autistic thinking, because we haven't got time to do anything else. So just a couple of quotes about autistic intelligence, or relevant to autistic intelligence. The first is a quote that's attributed to Einstein. If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And that harks back to what I said about in any area of life, if autistic or other neurodivergent people are just told there's one way to do this stuff based on the perception of autistic, non-autistic people, and if you fail at that, game over. Yeah, people are going to grow up feeling very sad, lonely, be convinced that they're stupid or whatever, when they're nothing of the sort. A quote from a paper, at least 2 of these, the authors of this paper are autistic. Michelle Dawson is quite a prominent critic of a lot of approaches to autistic people. She's autistic herself. But they wrote a series of papers on something called autistic intelligence. And they concluded autistic spectrum intelligence is atypical, wouldn't you know, but also genuine, general, and underestimated. And a lot of metrics that are used to measure intelligence, the standard IQ test and something called the Vessler scale, because they are set up with the assumption that everybody who takes those tests has a brain that operates in the same way, surprisingly, it don't work very well for autistic and other neurodivergent people. And so those people tend to score quite low. And that can have quite profound effects on their future life trajectories, obviously. Now, the aspect of thinking or processing that I'm going to concentrate on is called monotropism. Don't worry if you don't have to take away the jargon. But there's quite a nice little succinct quote from this guy, Fergus Murray. You might want to look up his article. The link will be in the materials that we send you afterwards. He says, well, this is the way I interpret it. So monotropism means one damn thing at a time. It refers to the fact that autistic people may have a lot of attributes and may acquire skills and all the rest of it. We can't exploit those or show you those if we're expected to do a million things at the same time. Like with the strong interests, it's more, let's focus on one damn thing at a time, and then I'll, be able to function properly. So he says, in a monotropic mind, fewer interests tend to be aroused at any time, and they attract more of our processing resources, making it harder to deal with things outside of our current attention tunnel. And I think an attention tunnel is a really good way of putting it. So in order to get into an activity or concentrate on something, sometimes we have to walk down, literally, in our minds, kind of walk down quite a long tunnel. Once we're in the tunnel, that's fine. We're in the zone, particularly getting into hyperfocus. If we get interrupted or we get expected to do something else at the same time, it's effectively we have to walk all the way back down that tunnel to a sort of central forum area and then choose another tunnel and walk all the way down there. If it's a temporary interruption, we then have to sort of like walk all the way back along that tunnel and walk back along the original tunnel before we can get back into the original activity. And the more times that's a big effort. The more time that happens, the worse it gets. So which areas does this influence? I'm only going to pick a few of these. So obviously having too much to think about at the same time sort of results in a horrible kind of brain freeze where, particularly if you're anxious about a lot of different things at the same time, your sort of thought processes about all these things can't cope very well, and it kind of freezes at a point where you're almost at maximum anxiety about all these things, but you can't do anything to resolve it. And at that point, you probably need to go for a walk or try and distract yourself from that and do something big to sort of change that and unfreeze it. In a lot of cases, regardless of how we're viewed in terms of our level of functioning, we need stuff broken down, lists, linear breakdowns, logical systematizing breakdowns of tasks and activities. And that's not babyish, it's just the way our brains work. It's much easier because, contrary to popular belief, not all autistic people are born with the innate ability to systematize, despite what some academics in the field say. You know, for a lot of us, you know, being bombarded with a lot of different things that we need to do, or being given a task which actually is not one task but a whole big sticky blob of subtasks, sometimes we need other people to actually present that to us visually in a way that's broken down. Do this first, then that, then that, then that. Even if we don't have, well, leaving aside specific sensory differences, which means that we might be hyper or hyposensitive to sound or visual stuff, our brains are quite often geared up to take in and store huge amounts of detail. So that if we're expected to perform tasks and perform at our best in an environment where there are a lot of ambient sounds going on from multiple different sources, both inside and outside the environment we're in, if the environment is very visually busy, so we're in a waiting room somewhere and it's plastered with all kinds of photographs, posters, and there's a lot of detail to take in, you know, it's going to be very difficult for us to focus in on one small aspect of that, i.e. somebody talking to us, giving us a bit of information or something we need to work on. You know, we need either to be given a different environment that's more neutral, or we need, if we have to stay in that environment, it need, you know, maybe screening of some sort to kind of cut down on the amount of visual detail, headphones, earbuds, whatever works. You know, those of you with school kids, you know, sometimes it's a bit tricky, but, you know, might have to try and negotiate with school. Look, there's a reason why my kid wears a hoodie. It's because it forms a nice tube around their face, which means that they can then cut down on the amount of visual detail and they just have some hope of concentrating on what they're supposed to be concentrating on. Yeah, obviously, this is where the focus on strong interests come from. And that, as I said, that influences who you socialize with and your style of socializing and where you feel comfortable and where you don't. Because if you're not going around hoovering up huge amounts of what we've termed superficial detail about a lot of mainstream topics that form the raw materials for small talk, that just means you can't really do small talk. It's in our interest to learn a bit of small talk, just a basic interaction, greetings, if necessary, even though it's completely obvious, you know, when somebody says, "Isn't it a sunny day?" It's kind of like, who would have known, kind of thing, you know. But anyway, acknowledging that, yeah, lovely, and then walking off, that sort of stuff's okay. But beyond that, we really struggle with small talk because we just haven't got the raw materials and we haven't got the interest in it either. And so we gravitate towards people, as I said, who may, you know, may exchange some sort of greeting or grunt with, and then get down to a really intense conversation that a lot of neurotypical people would find a bit off-putting, but works with other people. If we're keeping open too many channels of communication at the same time, that's not great, which is why sometimes we prefer to meet with people one-to-one, as long as it's not too intense, as long as it's not necessarily completely face-to-face. We might need to meet with people in parallel, so we're not staring each other's face or communicate via an object, but at the very least, we've got one channel of communication open. We're processing one lot of verbal and non-verbal body language. If other people join the party and start talking over each other, interrupting each other, it just gets really confusing. It even affects food. So again, leaving aside specific issues with taste and texture, a lot of autistic people who eat a wide range of food will only do so if none of those foods are touching and they're kept separate on the plate, or even better, in separate little compartments or pots. And that's to minimize the amount of sensory mashup that they're experiencing in their mouth at any one time. So, you know, somebody might say, I really like chips. You know, do you want tomato sauce with that? Yes, please. Don't, but then they get panicky. Don't put the tomato sauce on the chips. But I thought you just said you like tomato sauce. Yeah, I do. But just put that in a little pot and I'll eat that separately. You know, I like both the things separately because I can eat them one at a time, but I don't like it all mixed up together because otherwise some of the chips will, you know, have the qualities of chips, crisp on the outside, slightly salty, greasy on the outside, pasty on the inside. But some of those chips will also feature, they're a bit slimy, they're a bit, you know, a bit moist. They taste of tomato and vinegar and spices and stuff like that. And although, you know, I can deal with them separately, I can't deal with it together. So what are the tips for the day? Either if you're around autistic people or you're autistic themselves, you know, if you're autistic yourself, this is the kind of thing that you ought to be sort of like trying to communicate to people if you get asked about reasonable adjustments. So this is specifically to do with one damn thing at a time. You're going to be saying to people, now look, sometimes you're going to have to do some thinking about your priorities. So if you need to get a bit of information to me, the most important bit is that I receive that information. I'm allowed to process it, understand it in my own time, maybe ask some questions if I don't understand and stuff. That's the important bit. If you pile on lots of complications, so you actually deliver that to me in person, again, I've got verbal and non-verbal information to decode on top of the information that you're giving me. I've got a certain amount of social stress, depending on how close you are to me and whether we're talking in parallel via an object or whether you're just actually kind of expecting me to make eye contact and in my face kind of thing. There's a lot of sensory stress, so you might be wearing, you know, some perfume that you think makes you very alluring, or a body spray that makes you, you know, that you think is pleasant. Actually, it's making me feel sick. Or we're doing it in an environment where there's a lot of extraneous noise, or other people wandering around, or people keep interrupting us, or there's lots of visual detail for me to take in. There also might be a time pressure that you're putting on me. So by which you're giving me a bit of information, then saying, "What do you think?" and then hanging over me, which makes me break into a sweat because I've been unable to really process what you said, and the more pressure, these pressures are all in place, and then you put a time pressure on it, and suddenly I just can't think of anything. I can't remember my own name. So it's about getting people to to identify the kind of unnecessary layers, if you like, of processing they're expecting of you, and reduce them wherever possible. So take away the time pressure, the sensory stress, the social stress, the verbal and non-verbal processing. You know, just send me an email, send me a note, send me a WhatsApp. Sometimes, you know, you might have to say that to relatives, even if you're in the same room. If I'm feeling really stressed because I've just come home from work, you know, and I just need some chill time, you know, send me the information digitally or whatever. Don't come in and deliver it personally because I might just not be able to handle that and it might go badly. So that's stripping away stuff. In terms of transitions as well, because transitions are another thing that needs to be done one damn thing at a time. You know, maybe it's an idea like if, you know, with school children or whatever, they're moving class or they're moving school. But rather than sort of chuck them in the deep end and have an induction day with the rest of the class where the poor autistic person is expected to process a new transition, a new journey, which might or might not be quite noisy and problematic, a new physical environment, a new sensory environment, a new social environment, new demands, all in one big sticky blob. The more you can break that down into individual layers and gradually build it up, the better it might go. And so in terms of approaching a new physical environment where somebody has to transition, you start off virtually with pictures, with stuff online. If there's a virtual walkthrough, that would be brilliant. But But you give that to an autistic person, or as an autistic person, you ask if you can be left just to process that and work through it and familiarize yourself with it in the comfort of your own home, hopefully, where there aren't a lot of other stresses and strains. When you're ready to, maybe then you visit the actual physical environment. But even then, so people need to understand, actually, I'm just coming to sort of put what I've learned virtually into some sort of context of reality. Like, I'm just going to look at the real physical environment and further familiarize myself like that. I'm not really necessarily ready for a lot of social stuff yet. So please don't pounce on me, no matter how that might put neurotypical people at their ease. You'll scare me off if you immediately pounce on me as I come through the door and say, hello, lovely to meet you. I'm going to be your manager, and I just introduce you to my deputy manager, so and so, and here's some of who's head of HR. It's too soon for that stuff. When it does get down to meeting people, maybe they could send through a little resume with a photograph just detailing who they are and what they do. Even better, a short video or something like that. Again, you can process that in the comfort of your own home, get used to the idea of meeting those people before you actually meet them in the flesh. And again, those people hopefully should be primed to be, again, be sensitive and think it's the first time you've ever met them. If after 5-10 minutes you've had enough at that point. Then introduce the schedule. So what would be expected of me, roughly speaking? Let's have some sort of structure to the work or the study or whatever it is I'm facing, and then it might be good to go. This also works, in environments that unavoidably are going to become crowded, noisy, etc. It may not be ideal for an autistic person, but if they get there early and it gradually becomes crowded, noisy, etc. around them, that's easier to handle than just actually being chucked right into the middle of it when it's already established. So this is ideal world stuff, by the way. You won't always be able to sort of divide things down into these layers, but it's a good guide. The more you can do that, the less stressful for your autistic folks it will be. Or for you non-autistic folks, the better you'll be able to accommodate autistic people. So you start off with the physical and sensory, move on to the social, and finally move on to the structure. Okay, so just to summarize some adjustments that we might need as autistic people, we need others to chunk information and give adequate processing time, especially if they're giving information to us verbally. It doesn't mean that people have to speak to us as if we're idiots or small wounded animals. So you don't need the whole sort of like, hello, how are you? It's sort of, you know how it goes. It's nothing to do with our intelligence. It's just chunk information and leave a decent processing time. The verbal information, for reasons we don't have to go into, that we don't have time to go into at this point, are quite problematic anyway. And so the majority of time, I would suggest that if there is a significant piece of information or message that somebody needs to deliver, they need to get into the habit of delivering it, as I say, via an email, written or whatever, because again, we've got an opportunity to process that in our own time. If people can break down large bits of information into bulleted points, that's very handy as well, again, on that one damn thing at a time principle. It also means that, you can then, as an autistic person, highlight or put a cross by particular points that you don't understand, send it back to the person, you might get it explained in a way that might just prove embarrassing and impossible if the person in real time is giving you a load of verbal instructions and you're going, I'm sorry, no, you're gonna have to repeat that again. I didn't get half of that, sort of thing. And the more that they repeat it, the worse it gets. It's much better sometimes if it's fixed in a particular order. Whenever you look at it, it stays the same. It's easier to process. And you can also, as I say, communicate which bits you've understood and which bits you haven't. Because some of us, as part of our masking, will have had unfortunate experience where we ask people to repeat things beyond twice, and people get impatient and say, are you stupid or are you deaf? Now I'm going to repeat this one more time. Now pay attention, look at me. We don't want to put ourselves through that. The situation is getting overwhelming. And so as part of our masking, we've learned the quickest thing to do to get out of that situation is say, cool, I get that. Thanks. Yeah, I totally understand. That solves the immediate situation. But then we start panicking because we've been given some instructions. Somebody's going to come back in 10 minutes and say, well, why haven't you done it? I thought you said you understood. Written down is much better. So break down and systematize information, tasks, or transitions visually, one damn thing at a time. Really importantly, we need, if there are unavoidable rules, parameters, schedules, or agendas, we need to know about them in advance. And I think this is a mistake that's often made with autistic people, particularly if other people insist on giving them the label high functioning. They're all right, they get it. We don't have to be too explicit with this. It leads to some really bad misunderstandings, and it leaves autistic people saying, guys, could I just suggest something? Rather than wait till I break a rule and then put me on a disciplinary or, give me a good telling off or act as if I should have known that rule, how about, it's a revolutionary idea, you let me know those rules from the beginning. And for some neurotypicals, that might feel sometimes a bit brutal. But there was a case in point a good few years ago with our university mentoring group. And I used to deliver kind of annual training to them. And rather than just regurgitate the same stuff, I used to ask them, could you just give me a list of kind of live issues that you're having at present? And one of the years, the team leader sort of said, we do have a bit of a live issue. Because there's not much of an age gap between our mentors and some of the people that they're mentoring, we're getting increasingly a situation where after a couple of sessions, the students are asking the mentors, at the end of the session, I was just wondering, would you like to come for a drink with me later on? Or, I'm going to see such and such a film at the weekend. Would you fancy coming along with me? Or I'm going on holiday or something. Could you come on holiday with me? And, we obviously say, well, I think that's a bit inappropriate. That's beyond the parameters of my job. And I immediately sort of said, at what point and with what clarity do you deliver, a clear description of what you're here to do and what you're here not to do? And the person who was in post at the time said, well, we don't like to do that because it seems a bit like reading the Riot Act. We don't like to put people off. We want to establish trusting relationships, which is very important. I agree with that. But part of that process is just letting them know right from the beginning what you're there for and what you're not there for. Because from the autistic point of view, in that situation, obviously some people were thinking, God, this mentor is absolutely solid gold. So few people seem to get me and understand me and realize my needs and the fact that my struggles sometimes with academic work, they really get it. That's solid gold. Those people are rare in my life. They're actually doing a lot of good. I really like being around them. And so you can see logically in their mind after a couple of sessions, this person is really special. And actually, I find them quite attractive as well. So why wouldn't I ask them for a drink? That seems quite innocent. And I understand how these things go. And then the crushing humiliation when somebody turns around and says, no, I don't think so. In actual fact, that's quite inappropriate. No, that's beyond my remit. It would save a lot of that if these fair rules, parameters, schedules, and agendas were presented visually and in advance, so the person could process that. At the very least, you've got something you've got something to refer back to that you've agreed upon, and it doesn't seem to the autistic person that you're just making it up as you go along. Okay, specifically sensorily, as I said before, it's about trying to strip environments of unnecessary sensory clutter, I would call it. And there are quite often some easy wins. So, try stripping down or reducing the amount of visual clutter. Pictures, notice boards, knickknacks. Sometimes it's down to where we're positioned in a room. If we're positioned by a window, there's a busy street outside, that's not great. If there are a lot of reflective surfaces, for people who have got visual sensitivities, that's not great because it's distracting. Even down to if they're sitting near a window, it's a sunny day like it is today, and there's a tree just outside the window, and the sun is shining through the trees, and it's causing a kind of shimmering shadow on the opposite wall. These are things to be considered. Could you shift the person somewhere else so that they can concentrate more readily? Sound clutter. Trying to reduce. People shouldn't maybe be chatting quite so much in certain environments. They should be nipping outside to do that. They shouldn't be having kind of impromptu meetings within earshot. People should be, muting their phones so there aren't ringtones. Maybe also muting their computers if they're working on computers, so that you don't get email alerts coming off all the time. If you want somebody to concentrate, don't have a TV on in the background or music on in the background necessarily, unless they want it. Look at appliances. Are they working properly? Is the fridge making a weird buzzing noise? Is there aircon that makes clattering noise or some other weird noise when it comes on? These are relatively easy wins. Smells. So I said before, if you're an autistic person, you're perfectly entitled to request this if it's a problem. If you're a non-autistic person who's going to meet up with an autistic person in a professional capacity or whatever, don't feel as if you have to cover yourself in body spray, perfume, plug some sort of artificial air freshener in. Be also aware of cleaning products, particularly in toilets and places like that are absolutely necessary facilities. For some autistic people, encountering a toilet with too many kind of sanitary products, disinfecting products in it, and those little pooters that poot out perfume periodically might mean they can't use that space. Cooking, yes, cooking smells and stuff to some people might be utterly repulsive. So strip down the easy wins, and then it's quite a good idea that a lot of people are getting better with autistic and other neurodivergent people in mind at creating, for example, if somebody's coming into a new workplace or whatever, they're creating photo guides. Here's reception, turn left, here's the stairs that you have to go up, here's a landmark in the corridor that shows you're headed in the right direction. That's great. If it could be accompanied by a sensory guide for any sensory elements that remain that people can't do anything about. So, for example, in the place that I used to work at, the training room involved walking past a cafe. And, I would supply for autistic groups that I was running, I would supply a sensory guide which said, now between these times, you're liable to encounter the smell of burning cheese, bacon, sausages, frying, etc., etc. If any of this is the problem, A, there's an alternative route where you might be able to avoid that. B, if we can't avoid it, you might have things that you can bring in with you. So a particular smell that you like on a hanky or some other piece of material or whatever, where you can mask that horrible smell just for the duration as you get past it. But forewarned is forearmed. If autistic people don't know about this stuff in advance, again, that might make the difference between them being able to access something and not, because they won't have come prepared. Okay, finally, these are what we've been discussing have been examples of what's called reasonable adjustments. And for all the autistic folks there, you never need to feel as if you're sort of pushing it a bit or you're trying to take advantage by asking for reasonable adjustments. You are fully covered by the Equality Act, because the Equality Act says there's a duty to make reasonable adjustments if you are placed at a substantial disadvantage because of your disability. Now, you might argue whether being autistic is a disability or not, but in terms of the law and the official pronouncements on it, sometimes you do have to just suck that up and think, in this point, I just have to go with the vocabulary that they're using. So substantial disadvantage because of your disability compared with non-disabled people or people who don't share your disability. And substantial means more than minor or trivial. And so, that fits the bill completely. The environments that neurotypicals can put up with, we can't. And that will put us at a disadvantage in that environment. And that's what it's all about. So I'm going to leave you with something called the double empathy problem. So this is the only time you'll see me portray an autistic person as a jigsaw puzzle piece. It's outdated, it's pretty offensive in the way that it's used most of the time. But anyway, it does imply that we are, as autistic people, the puzzle, the enigma that needs to be cracked, the mystery, and so forth. No doubt, it does appear like that way to neurotypical people. But what they're not taking into consideration is neurotypical people appear exactly the same to us. We can't often see any rational or logical reason for their behavior. Sometimes we have a struggle to get inside their heads and know what's going on in their, how their brain is processing the world. And so reasonable adjustment should be just an attempt to bring everybody up to the same level so they can function at their best. And this refers to something called the double empathy problem, which has been coined by an actually autistic academic called Damien Milton. And in plain language, it means that because of different brain wiring and life experiences, non-autistic and autistic people, and this is the important bit, can easily misunderstand one another. It's a bidirectional problem, which means there's likely a bidirectional solution. So by bidirectional, they mean a two-way problem. It's mutual misunderstanding. And to say that one group, i.e. the autistic people, are wrong and that they need fixing is a bit unfair. That's not, creating environments that don't disadvantage them. That's expecting them to mask. There's a lot of work that neurotypical society needs to do to become better at understanding and accommodating us and taking on a bit more of the sort of the workload, so to speak, rather than placing all the emphasis on us to fit in. So I'll leave you with this. This is a quote about neurodiversity, which is great. It's by somebody called Nick Walker. They are sort of quite intersectional because they're autistic and trans. So they say neurodiversity is an essential form of human diversity. The idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind or one right style of neurocognitive functioning is no more valid than the idea that there is one normal or right gender, race, or culture. When embraced, diversity can act as a source of creative potential. And so I would always argue that neurodiversity, right from the word go when kids go to school, neurodiversity needs to be right up there in the teaching priorities, along with gender diversity, acceptance of religious diversity, of ethnic diversity, because we know that societies work better when more people's perspective is taken into account. It becomes richer. Okay, thank you very much for attending. It's been very weird not having a visible audience, but yes, I'm getting over it. So for further information about information, advice and guidance, training, consultancy, registered services, etc., and lots more, you can look at our website, which is autism, predictably, autismhampshire.org.uk, fairly straightforward, and there'll be information there.